In the deep forests of Colorado, nature keeps its secrets in its own way. There are no locks, no codes, only layers of earth, fallen leaves, and silent trees hiding things that often take years for humans to uncover. On a summer afternoon in 1999, in the San Juan Mountains, a group of hikers stumbled upon a strange sight. A pale, thick cluster of mushrooms, growing unusually dense beneath the roots of a massive spruce tree. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a natural curiosity. But when they dug gently into the soft soil out of curiosity, the truth that emerged was chilling. Beneath the roots was not rock, not tangled wood, but human bones. Even more unsettling, the remains lay beside a heavy jacket, the kind popular in the early 1990s. Only then did people realize what the forest had been hiding for so long. The answer to a disappearance that had haunted 7 years of silence. A tourist who vanished in 1992, now reduced to bones resting under a tree, with mushrooms spreading thickly around, like a haunting veil drawn by the wilderness itself. He was not a famous man, nor someone whose name would have ever made the headlines, at least not until he disappeared. Friends remembered him as quiet, thoughtful, and endlessly fascinated by the outdoors. He was in his late 20s in the early 1990s, a time when Colorado's rugged wilderness still felt like a promise of freedom, a place where a man could disappear into the trees and hear only his own heartbeat. For him, the forest was not just scenery, it was a refuge from the noise of modern life. Born in a small Midwestern town, he grew up surrounded by fields and long, open roads. Nature had always been close to him, but it was the mountains he longed for. Stories of the Rockies filled his imagination since childhood. Snow-capped peaks that pierced the sky, alpine meadows hidden away like treasures, and endless trails that stretched toward the horizon. After finishing college and working a steady but unremarkable job, he saved enough money for a long trip west. That was where his heart wanted to go, to the wild places he had only read about. In the spring of 1992, he finally set out. His plan was simple: to hike in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, camp under the stars, and live for a short while, with nothing but a backpack and the ground beneath him. He packed carefully Gore-Tex jacket, sturdy boots, a small journal, and a camera to capture the beauty he was sure to find. His family later said he seemed lighter in spirit when he spoke about the trip, as though he had been waiting for it all his life. The morning he left, his parents stood at the doorway, watching as he loaded his gear into the car. His mother, always the worrier, reminded him of the dangers: wild animals, sudden storms, the risk of losing the trail. He smiled and reassured her that he was prepared, that he had read guidebooks and maps, that nothing would go wrong. His father, though quieter, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, with a look that carried both pride and concern. None of them knew that this would be the last moment they would see him alive. When he arrived in Colorado, he checked into a small lodge near the edge of town, planning to use it as a base for a few nights before venturing deeper into the backcountry. Witnesses recalled seeing him buy supplies: a few cans of food, extra batteries, and a map of the national forest. One store clerk remembered his politeness, the way he studied the shelves as if trying to make sure nothing essential was forgotten. Later that evening, he was seen heading up the road, the weight of his pack heavy, but his steps steady, full of anticipation. No one could have imagined that the path he took that day would be his last. The trail wound upward into the trees, swallowing him in silence. For 7 long years, his footprints would be the final trace of his existence, until the forest chose to reveal what it had been keeping all along. When the young man did not return from his hike, at first, no one panicked. In the early 1990s, cell phones were rare, and hikers often stayed in the backcountry for days at a time. It was common to lose track of schedules when wandering the trails, and his family told themselves he was probably just enjoying the mountains longer than expected. But as days passed, the silence stretched into worry, and then into fear. The alarm was raised when he missed his planned call home. His parents, who had been anxiously waiting by the phone, contacted the local authorities in Colorado. Soon, search and rescue teams were mobilized, And what began as a routine missing hiker report turned into one of the largest searches the San Juan Mountains had seen in years. Helicopters hovered above the ridges, their blades chopping the thin alpine air as spotters leaned out, scanning the dense green below for any sign, a bright jacket, a movement, anything that could break the monotony of the forest floor. On the ground, searchers combed the trails, calling his name into the silence, their voices echoing faintly through the canyons. Dogs were brought in, trained to pick up human scent. They sniffed along riverbanks, rocky slopes, and thick underbrush. At times, the handlers thought the dogs had caught a trace, but the leads always dissolved into nothing, as though the forest itself had swallowed the trail. It was as if he had stepped off the map and vanished into a place no one else could reach. Volunteers came from neighboring towns, carrying flashlights and wearing out their boots as they walked grid after grid through the wilderness. They searched in daylight and in the deep hours of the night, guided by headlamps and hope. Some carried whistles, blowing them in intervals, praying for an answering call. But the woods remained silent. Weeks stretched into months. Posters with his photograph were tacked up on trailheads and bulletin boards at gas stations, asking if anyone had seen a lone hiker. His parents made the long drive back and forth from their home to Colorado, clinging to any scrap of information. Each time the phone rang, they held their breath, hoping it was the call that would bring their son back to them. But the phone only brought dead ends. The theories grew as the search dragged on. Some believed he had fallen into a ravine, hidden from sight by the thick canopy. Others whispered that he might have encountered a wild animal. A few suggested he had simply chosen to walk away from his life, vanishing into the wilderness by choice. But those who knew him best dismissed that idea. He loved adventure, yes, but he loved his family more. He would never have left them in torment willingly. By winter, snow blanketed the mountains, erasing any chance of finding tracks or scattered belongings. The San Juans became a world of white, hiding its secrets beneath ice and silence. The search was called off, though his parents begged authorities not to give up. Year after year, they returned to the place where he was last seen. On anniversaries, they laid flowers at the trailhead, speaking to the air as though he could somehow hear them. Locals remembered the family's quiet persistence, the father standing for long hours looking into the trees, the mother clutching a photograph worn from being held too often. Despite the countless man-hours, despite the helicopters, dogs, and volunteers, the forest yielded nothing. No backpack, no scraps of clothing, no sign of struggle, just absence. It was as though the young man had stepped into the wilderness and been erased by it, leaving only the echo of unanswered questions. After the search was called off, what remained was silence. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the heavy kind that presses down on every thought, every sleepless night. 7 years is a long time to live without answers, and for his family, each day was its own trial. His parents tried to return to normal life, but normalcy never truly returned. At the dinner table, his chair remained empty, but no one had the heart to move it. His room stayed untouched, clothes folded neatly in drawers, his favorite books stacked by the bedside. Some nights, his mother would slip quietly into the room, sit on the edge of the bed, and whisper to the darkness, as though her son might somehow hear her. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived, carrying both joy and a deep, aching absence. Friends who had once shared laughter with him grew older, started families, moved on with their lives. But his family remained caught in a kind of suspended time, waiting for the knock at the door that never came. Every year, when the snow melted and the trails reopened, his parents returned to Colorado. They walked the paths he once walked, laid flowers at the trailhead, and stood in silence as the wind moved through the pines. Sometimes strangers joined them, hikers who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. Other times it was just the two of them, alone with their grief, staring into the endless green where their son had vanished. Rumors continued to swirl in the nearby towns. Some insisted he had been attacked by an animal and dragged into some hidden place. Others spoke of hidden caves in the San Juans, deep crevices where a body might lie undiscovered forever. A few whispered stranger theories, abduction, or even something unearthly. But none of those stories brought comfort. For his parents, the truth was simpler and more painful. Their son had gone into the forest, and the forest had not given him back. The authorities eventually filed his case away as unresolved, another name in the long list of those who disappear each year in America's wilderness. For the officials, it became just another file gathering dust. But for his family, it was an open wound that never healed. As the years dragged on, the hope of finding him alive faded, replaced by a quieter, more desperate wish that at least his remains might be found, that there might be something tangible to grieve, something to lay to rest. But the mountains remained unmoved, the trees holding their secrets close. By the 7th year, his parents had learned to live with the silence, though it never stopped echoing through their lives. They no longer expected a miracle, but they prayed, still, even if only for closure. And though they could not know it then, the answer they sought was waiting not far from where the search had once begun, hidden beneath the roots of an ancient tree, guarded by the strange growth of mushrooms that thrived in the shadows. It was the summer of 1999 when the forest finally broke its silence. A group of hikers, unfamiliar with the story of the missing tourist, set out on a trail that was less traveled, winding deeper into the San Juan Mountains than most casual visitors dared to go. The path was narrow, the undergrowth thick, and the trees stood like ancient guardians. They were not looking for anything unusual that day, just adventure, solitude, and perhaps the thrill of finding a hidden view. As the afternoon sun began to dip, one of the hikers noticed something odd near the base of a massive spruce tree. The ground there seemed unusually disturbed, with pale shapes breaking through the carpet of pine needles. At first glance, it looked like a cluster of mushrooms, large and ghostly white, growing in unnatural density. Curious, they drew closer, remarking on how strange it was to see such a heavy bloom in one concentrated spot. But curiosity soon turned to unease. Beneath the fungal growth, half buried in soil and tangled roots, something hard and irregular caught the light. It was not stone. When they brushed the earth away with trembling hands, they froze. What emerged was the curve of a human skull, its surface weathered but unmistakable. The group recoiled in shock, their hearts pounding. For a long moment, no one spoke. The forest around them seemed to fall into an even deeper silence, as if holding its breath. Then, with shaking voices, they agreed. They had to call the authorities. When search teams arrived, the scene was grim. There, resting against the roots of the tree, lay the remains of the man who had vanished 7 years before. The bones were partially intact, arranged as though he had sat down at the base of the tree and never stood again. His backpack, weathered by years of rain and snow, lay nearby. Inside, investigators found small, haunting reminders of his final days. A rusted flashlight, a few torn pages from a journal, and a water flask long emptied. But it was the mushrooms that unsettled even the most hardened rescuers. They had spread thickly around the skeleton, sprouting from the earth as if nourished by his very presence. Some whispered that the forest had been feeding on him, turning his body into part of its endless cycle. Others thought of it differently, that nature had cloaked him, covering him in a shroud until the time came for him to be found. For the family, the discovery was both devastating and strangely relieving. After 7 years of torment, there was finally something to bring home, something to bury. Yet the image of their son's body beneath a tree, circled by pale fungi, haunted them deeply. It was not the peaceful ending they had prayed for, but at least the waiting had ended. Investigators tried to piece together what might have happened. The position of the remains suggested exhaustion or injury, that he had chosen to rest against the tree and simply never risen again. There were no signs of an animal attack, no evidence of foul play. His death seemed to be the slow, tragic result of being lost and alone in a wilderness that offers no mercy. Still, the mystery lingered. How had so many searches passed so close without finding him? Why had dogs not caught his scent? Why had helicopters not spotted his gear? The tree under which he lay was less than 2 miles from one of the main trails. For years, people had walked within shouting distance, unaware that his body was silently waiting beneath their feet. In the end, the forest had decided when to reveal him. And when it did, it revealed him in a way no one could forget, seated beneath an ancient tree, mushrooms spreading like a veil of secrecy around the life that once was. The discovery of the young tourist's remains raised as many questions as it answered. For his family, the relief of closure was tempered by unsettling mysteries. Why had he been invisible to years of searching? Why had mushrooms grown so thickly around him, as though they alone knew he was there? Scientists, locals, and spiritual voices all began to offer explanations, none of them complete, each one leaving the forest shrouded in mystery. From a scientific perspective, the answer seemed straightforward. The man had likely become disoriented in the maze of trees, exhaustion setting in after days without adequate food or water. In survival scenarios, it is not uncommon for lost hikers to choose a tree to rest against, to gather strength, or to face their final moments with some sense of shelter. His posture suggested surrender, as if he had simply sat down and never stood again. The mushrooms, too, had a biological explanation. Fungi thrive on decay, feeding on organic material hidden in the soil. His body, over 7 years, had returned to the earth, nourishing the underground network of roots and fungi. What looked eerie and supernatural, the pale ring of mushrooms, was in fact the natural cycle of life and death. In a sense, his presence had become part of the forest, fueling its quiet growth. Yet, even with science, unease remained. Searchers had combed this very area with dogs and helicopters. How could they have missed him, sitting only a short distance from a main trail? Some suggested that the dense canopy had shielded him from aerial searches, while shifting soil and seasonal growth may have hidden his body from the ground teams. Others argued that human error was the simplest explanation. Perhaps they had passed by, focused on other directions, blind to what was right before them. Still, locals whispered of something more. The way the mushrooms encircled him, the way the forest had hidden him so thoroughly, carried a spiritual weight. To some, it felt as though the forest had claimed him, keeping him close until it was ready to let go. In folklore, trees and fungi often symbolize guardianship, or gateways, bridges between the living world and what lies beyond. Was it possible, some wondered, that the old spruce had become both his shelter and his tomb, protecting him from being found until the moment was right? His parents, though grounded in practicality, could not ignore the strangeness. His mother once said in an interview, "It's almost as if the woods didn't want us to have him back. Not yet." As if they were keeping him safe. That thought, though unsettling, gave her a strange kind of comfort that their son had not been alone, but held gently by the very wilderness he loved. There were also more unsettling theories. Some believed he had chosen the tree deliberately, guided there by a sense he could not explain. Others, less rational but persistent, spoke of the San Juans as a place of strange disappearances, where compasses spun and people walked into, the trees never to return. To them, his death was not an accident, but part of something larger, an unsolved pattern that defied logic. In the end, the explanation split into two paths: science, which spoke of biology, chance, and human error, and spirit, which spoke of mystery, destiny, and the will of the wilderness. Neither could fully erase the haunting image of a man seated under a tree, mushrooms rising like pale sentinels around him. And perhaps that is the truest explanation, that the forest had the final word. It gave him peace. It gave him silence. And when the time came, it gave him back. Not as he once was, but as part of its eternal cycle, a story that would remind everyone who heard it that the line between science and the unknown is thinner than we dare to believe. The forest had held him for 7 long years, and when it finally returned him, it did so in a way no one could forget. A young man who had once dreamed of adventure, who had walked eagerly into the wild with hope in his heart, was found not in triumph, but in silence, seated beneath a tree, embraced by the earth, surrounded by the strange bloom of mushrooms that seem to whisper of both life and decay. His story lingers because it touches something deeper than tragedy alone. It reminds us of the thin line between human fragility and nature's immensity. We walk into the wilderness with our gear, our plans, and our confidence, but the forest does not bend to our will. It does not explain itself. It holds its secrets until it chooses otherwise. For his parents, closure came at a terrible price. They finally had a place to lay flowers, a grave to kneel beside, but no true answer to the question that haunted them. Why? Why did it take so long to find him, so close to the paths where others had walked? Why did the forest conceal him, only to reveal him later in such a haunting state? Those questions remain, echoing quietly in the silence of the San Juan Mountains. Perhaps that is the lasting message of his story, that in the face of wilderness, certainty is an illusion. We can prepare, we can plan, and still the unexpected will come. For those who venture into the mountains, it is a reminder to respect their vastness, to prepare with humility, and to remember that each step into the trees is a step into the unknown. And yet, there is also a strange kind of peace in how he was found. Not torn apart, not hidden forever, but resting beneath an ancient tree, as if the forest had kept him close, waiting until the world was ready to know. It is a haunting image, yes, but also one that speaks of belonging of a man who became part of the place he loved most. The forest keeps its secrets, but sometimes it gives them back in its own time, in its own way. And when it does, it leaves us not with answers, but with stories. Stories that remind us that nature is vast, mysterious, and always more powerful than we dare to imagine.